Having made a precariously secretive journey across the Pacific, a story in its own right, the First Air Fleet arrived within striking distance of their target. They had achieved complete surprise. The first attack wave of 183 warplanes, led by Commander Mitsuo Fukita, was launched north of Oahu. On the morning of December 7, 1941, shortly before 8 a.m. local time, American sailors and other personnel at Pearl Harbor looked up to find an unfamiliar host of aircraft passing through their skies. Without warning, the Japanese planes would proceed to strike the Pacific Fleet, wreaking devastation upon the warships and installations. The first wave consisted of 3 groups. The first group was comprised of 49 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers, carrying 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, as well as 40 B-5N bombers carrying Type 91 torpedoes. Their focus was the battleships, namely those in Battleship Row. The second group was made up of 51 Aichi Val dive bombers, armed with 249-kilogram bombs, assigned to target Ford Island and Wheeler Field. The third group consisted of 43 Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighters, meant to handle air control and strafing. Arizona's primary peril would come from the first group. Mistaken for arriving B-17s by radar operators, their arrival went virtually unhindered by American forces on the ground or their scarce aircraft still in the air during the opening moments of the attack. On board Arizona, the ship's air raid alarm went off at 07:55 hours, and her crew rushed to general quarters soon after. Shortly after 0800 hours, a group of 10 Nakajima K torpedo bombers, 5 each from the carriers Kaga and Hiryu, attacked Arizona and the neighboring Vestal. All of them were under the command of Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Kusumi. All were carrying armor-piercing shells, modified into 797-kilogram or 1,757-pound bombs, and were flying at an estimated altitude of 3,000 meters or 9,800 feet. The Hiryu Group's target acquisition bomber was flying point and selected their battleship target. Using a small, white rectangular flag, the lead target acquiring bomber signaled the 4 others to release their bombs. Shortly after the bombs from Kaga's aircraft struck Arizona from amidships to stern, Hiryu's bombs hit the bow, scoring 4 hits on Arizona and 3 near misses. The sternmost bomb ricocheted off the face of Turret 4 and penetrated the deck to detonate in the captain's pantry, causing a small fire in the process. The next forwardmost hit was near the port edge of the ship and is believed to have detonated in the area of the anti-torpedo bulkhead. The next bomb struck near the port rear 5-inch AA gun. Around the same time, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Glenn Fukuwa was fighting to navigate the raging chaos that was the Arizona's top deck. At the outset of the attack on the ship, Fukuwa rushed to the quarterdeck, to which he was attached. There he was stunned and knocked down by the explosion of a large bomb, which hit the quarterdeck, penetrating several decks before starting a severe fire below. This was presumably the same bomb that landed in the captain's pantry. Upon regaining consciousness, Fukuwa began to direct the crew's firefighting efforts and the rescue of the wounded and injured personnel. Meanwhile, high up above, Lieutenant Commander Kusumi's bombardier, Lieutenant Shujiro Kondo, sighted the image of the ship in his crosshairs. Timing it just right, he pulled the trigger at 0806 hours, releasing a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb. It would soar down the full 10,000-foot descent towards its target for 26 seconds before penetrating through the armored deck near Turret 2, piercing into Arizona's very full forward magazines. From this point onward, Arizona's remaining life was measured in seconds. 7 to be exact. The forward magazines would detonate in a catastrophic explosion, venting through the sides of the ship and absolutely gutting much of the interior of her forward structure. The blast is said to have been so strong that it lifted Arizona's forward area out of the water, sending out a shockwave of pressurized air that extinguished the fires raging on the repair ship Vestal still moored alongside her. Due to the violent evisceration of her forward area, both Turret 1 and 2 as well as the conning tower, would collapse downward some 25 to 30 feet. The foremast and funnel would likewise collapse forward, effectively tearing the ship in half, not too differently from how she left the trawler Umatilla several years earlier. In the immediate aftermath of the detonation, the whole forward part of the ship was enveloped in flames, which were spreading rapidly. Wounded and badly burned crewmen were pouring out of the ship to the quarterdeck, where a stunned Lieutenant Commander Fukuwa was located. Despite these conditions, his harrowing experience, and severe enemy bombing and strafing, Fukuwa continued to direct the fighting of the fires in order to keep them in check. All the while, the wounded and burned were taken from the ship as he supervised the rescue of those men. He is said to have conducted himself in an amazingly calm and cool manner, and with such excellent judgment that it inspired everyone who saw him and undoubtedly resulted in the saving of many lives. After realizing the ship could not be saved, and that he was the senior surviving officer aboard, he directed it to be abandoned, but continued to remain on the quarterdeck. He continued to guide the abandoning of the now sinking Arizona and the rescue of her personnel, helping some 330 to 350 sailors to safety. He remained on board until he was satisfied that the crew that could be saved were saved, after which he left the ship. Despite his valiant efforts, however, he would depart Arizona without the overwhelming majority of his fellow shipmates. In a moment, even in the blink of an eye, the bombs and subsequent magazine explosion had killed 1,177 of the 1,512 crewmen on board at the time. This was more than 75% of the crew that was on the Arizona when she was attacked, meaning that for every man that escaped her alive, 3 more did not. This included both the ship's captain, Captain Van Valkenburg, and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, the 2 highest-ranking officers on board. Both had been on the bridge when the magazine explosion destroyed their position, leaving their remains completely unrecoverable. All that was ever found of Kidd was his Naval Academy-class ring, which Navy divers would later find fused to the steel bulkhead of the conning tower by the sheer heat of the inferno. Arizona's casualties would make up approximately half of the lives lost during the overall attack, but the attack itself was far from over. Aft of Arizona, her older cousin USS Nevada would make a break for open water. Her position at the northwestward end of Battleship Row, with no other ships moored alongside her, gave her the best chance at escape. She was harried by Japanese Val dive bombers who were hoping to sink her in the channel and use her wreck to clog up the entrance to Pearl Harbor. She was struck with a minimum of 1 torpedo and 6 bombs, one of the latter even penetrating into the ship and exploding near the gasoline tank. Leakage and vapors from the tank created intense fires around the ship, particularly around Nevada's Turret 1. These flames might have caused Nevada to meet a similar fate to Arizona had her main magazines not already been empty. In return, the Nevada's anti-aircraft guns would take at least 7 Japanese planes with her before she would ultimately be beached at Hospital Point, suffering 60 killed, 109 wounded, and possibly as many as 10 bomb hits. USS West Virginia was tied alongside her older cousin Tennessee when she was struck by a pair of 16-inch 410mm armor-piercing shells, as well as 7 Type 91 torpedoes on her port side. The latter opened 2 large holes in her hull, barely avoiding capsizing due to damage control. As the ship began to sink, Doris Miller, an African-American naval cook assigned to her, would use an anti-aircraft gun he had no training with whatsoever to shoot down a Japanese plane, though he is suspected of having possibly shot down as many as 6. Fuel oil leaking from the now blazing wreck of the Arizona caught fire and engulfed West Virginia in flames, which was also fed by her own leaking fuel oil. West Virginia would lose a total of 106 men, among them 3 sailors who survived in an airtight storeroom for a determined 16 days before passing away. USS Tennessee was moored beside West Virginia. She was protected from torpedo attacks and survived a pair of bomb attacks relatively intact. However, the explosion from Arizona showered burning oil over Tennessee's stern, and she was quickly surrounded by fire, which was added onto by oil leaking from West Virginia. Fire warped some of her hull plates, and she was trapped in place when West Virginia sank and came to rest up against her, forcing her up against the concrete quay. Nevertheless, her anti-aircraft guns would take down or at least assist in destroying 5 Japanese aircraft. USS Oklahoma, Arizona's older cousin, would suffer the same fate as her fellow ships moored in Battleship Row's outboard positions. 3 near-simultaneous torpedo hits struck beneath her waterline, the third dealing major damage to her hull. As she began capsizing, she was struck by 2 more torpedoes. Her men were strafed as they tried to escape. Some 429 of her officers and crew were killed or went missing, 32 were wounded, and a significant number were trapped within the ship, awaiting a rescue that, for many of them, would not arrive in time. Beside Oklahoma, USS Maryland received many of Oklahoma's crew, who were now clambering aboard to assist with her anti-aircraft defense. She was struck by 2 armor-piercing bombs, which detonated low on her hull. She lost 4 of her personnel, but otherwise managed to stubbornly survive the situation relatively intact. The last and southernmost battleship in Battleship Row, USS California, was strafed by Japanese Zeros and struck by 2 torpedoes. As water streamed into her interior, she was attacked further by dive bombers with an armor-piercing shell piercing her second deck, the resulting explosion claiming 50 of her crew. Ultimately, 104 of her men were killed and 61 were wounded. Not to take away from what happened to these men and these vessels, but the combined loss of life from all of the other ships in Battleship Row would not surpass the death toll that had been inflicted upon the Arizona. A minority of her sailors managed to survive the explosion, most having perished in the incinerating inferno that flashed through her decks, drowned within the inaccessible recesses of the ship, or succumbed to wounds too severe to be healed. Those fortunate few who remained were now a crew without a ship. The attack on Pearl Harbor would see more casualties among other U.S. military personnel, as well as other naval assets. Of the 8 United States Navy battleships present, all were damaged, and 4 were sunk. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and a mine layer. More than 180 U.S. aircraft were destroyed. Some 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 more were wounded, making it the deadliest event ever recorded in Hawaii. Japanese losses were lighter in comparison, 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines lost, with 129 servicemen killed in total. Japan would declare war on the United States and the British Empire just several hours later, as they carried out their pre-planned campaign to seize massive swaths of territory in the Pacific. The declaration would not be delivered to its intended recipients until the next day, on December 8th. By then, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, once the young Assistant Naval Secretary who had hammered the first bolt of Arizona's keel into place almost 30 years earlier, was standing before a joint session of Congress. Now in his 3rd term as president, he would deliver his famous Day of Infamy speech, which would expose to both the United States government and the American public the extent of the losses suffered at Pearl Harbor. His message would end with an appeal to Congress for America's own declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. The answer would be overwhelming, an 82-0 vote in favor from the Senate and a landslide vote of 338-1 from the House in favor. SJ Resolution 116 would arrive 1 hour after Roosevelt's speech, officially declaring war on Japan. With Hitler's own declaration of war on America delivered just 3 days later, on the 11th, Congress would answer that very same day with SJ Resolution 119, declaring war on Germany. Thus, America, its people, its soldiers, and its ships were now officially a part of the Second World War, coming in once again on the side of the Allies, such as Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, salvage operations were already well underway at Pearl Harbor to restore those ships that could still be recovered. Of the 8 damaged battleships, 7 were raised, and 6 would soon go on to serve in the war. The 8th was the Arizona. It was evident from the very same day of the attack that the USS Arizona was dead in every way that a ship of her class could be. The magazine explosion had reaped irreparable damage to her interior, casting a rainfall of debris down on nearby Ford Island and setting fierce fires that burned for 2 days. While other battleships who were there at Pearl Harbor that day, such as Pennsylvania, would go on to achieve victories against the Empire of Japan, such was not to be the case for the Arizona. She would remain under 40 feet of water, her hull fully settled on the bottom of the channel. Even to this day, she remains in the exact same spot where she died, a submerged, coral-encrusted testament to the suddenness and viciousness of the events of December 7th. She is a tomb to the over 1,100 sailors that perished aboard her, all of whom could not have known as they woke up that day that it was not only their last, but also the last for many of their friends around them. Members of the USS Arizona Band, known as Navy Band Unit 22, had performed on November 22, 1941, in the semi-final round of the Battle of Music at the Block Arena at Pearl Harbor. They finished second and had advanced to a final competition that would never be held. Everyone in the band died on board the Arizona during the Japanese attack. The famous 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, would go into the Navy to avenge their sister Genevieve's boyfriend, Bill Ball, who had died aboard the Arizona. They would serve together aboard the light cruiser USS Juneau. They would also die together when she was sunk in an eerily similar manner, a torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-26 striking her near her magazine, causing the ship to explode and sink. Following the attack, several of Arizona's sailors received medals for their conduct and actions under fire. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fukua, who had earned the Medal of Honor for his cool-headedness while quelling the flames and helping survivors to escape the ship. The Medal of Honor was also given posthumously to Rear Admiral Kidd, the first American flag officer to be killed in the Pacific War, and Captain Van Valkenburg, who had reached Arizona's bridge and was attempting to defend his ship when the magazine explosion destroyed it. Arizona herself would be awarded 1 battle star for her service in the Second World War, her fiery death serving as the symbol of America's entrance into the war for ages to come. On December 29th, 23 days after her sinking, Arizona was declared to be temporarily out of service. In 1942, her surviving superstructure was scrapped. By December 1st of the same year, she would be officially stricken from the Naval Vessel Register. Her main armament would be salvaged over the next year and a half. Her aft turrets were removed. They would later be reinstalled as United States Army Coast Artillery Corps Battery, Arizona, at Kahe Point on the west coast of Oahu, and Battery Pennsylvania on the Mokapu Peninsula. While training, Battery Pennsylvania would fire its guns for the first and last time on VJ Day in August 1945. The nearby Battery Arizona was never completed. Both forward turrets remained where they were, although the guns from Turret 2 were later reinstalled on USS Nevada in 1944. She would go on to fire these same guns against Japanese forces on the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, allowing Arizona at least some recompense against the empire that had ended her so suddenly. Since her destruction, 2 competing hypotheses have arisen about the cause of the explosion. The first is that the bomb detonated in or near the black powder magazine used for her saluting guns and catapult charges. The bomb would have detonated first and then ignited the smokeless powder magazines, which were used for the ship's main armament. It's been proposed that a hatch leading to the black powder magazine was left open, possibly with flammable materials stocked nearby. Another possibility suggests that black powder might have been stockpiled outside the armored magazine. The second hypothesis is that the bomb penetrated her armored decks and detonated directly inside one of the starboard magazines. The only problem with this theory is that smokeless powder is fairly difficult to detonate. The 14-inch powder bags required a black powder pad to quickly ignite the powder. The time elapsed from the bomb hit to the magazine explosion was shorter than what was required for burning smokeless powder to explode. The final answer to exactly how Arizona died is not likely to ever be solved, as the explosion proved so devastating that very little evidence remains as to the precise circumstances behind the magazine explosion. The wreck of Arizona would remain at Pearl Harbor to commemorate the loss of both her and her crew. Almost a decade after her sinking, on March 7, 1950, Admiral Arthur W. Radford, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet at the time, established the raising of colors over her remains as a recurring tradition. Legislation would soon be passed during the respective administrations of Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. The wreck would consequently become a national shrine in 1962. A memorial was built across the ship's sunken remains, inclusive of a shrine room. There, the names of the lost crew are listed on a marble wall. 4 years later, Arizona was officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places on October 15, 1966, and was subsequently designated a National Historic Landmark 2 decades later on May 5, 1989. She retains this status as well as her memorial site to this very day. Now, upon their death, survivors of the attack can have their ashes placed within the ship, there to rest among their fallen comrades. Those who served aboard her at other times can have their ashes scattered in the water above the ship. While her superstructure and 2 of her main gun turrets were removed, the barbette of one of the turrets remains visible above the water. Even now, 2.3 quarts or 2.18 liters of oil still leaks from her hull and into the waters of the harbor per day. Solutions are still being sought to prevent it while also preserving the wreck. Various artifacts from the ship would go on to survive Arizona's destruction. Currently, one of her original bells now hangs in the University of Arizona's Student Union Memorial Center bell tower. There, it is rung after every home football victory over any team except other Arizona schools. A gun, mast, as well as an anchor from Arizona are in the Wesley Bolden Memorial Plaza in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. The gun is paired alongside another gun from the battleship Missouri, aboard which Japan had surrendered, representing both the start and end of the war in the Pacific for America. Every 2 years, the Navy awards the USS Arizona Memorial Trophy to a ship that has achieved the highest combat readiness in strike warfare, surface fire support, and anti-surface warfare. In my opinion, it's impossible to say that Arizona ever got to truly demonstrate her full potential throughout her quarter of a century of life. She didn't get to serve directly in the First World War due to her nature as a coal-burning ship. She served no serious combat roles in the years between the wars, functioning more as a rescue ship to disaster sites, both natural and man-made, such as at Long Beach and Smyrna. She traveled the world, engaged in more than her fair share of training exercises, and received a number of modifications that made her more than a match for most of her contemporaries. But that's it. In my eyes, and perhaps mine alone, Arizona's story is that of a twofold tragedy that continues to unfold even in our time. It's the story of a well-polished, powerful weapon that spent her entire life sitting on a wall, never coming down, never fighting the war she was meant to fight, only for the arrival of that very same war to see her destroyed beyond repair, and that before she could fire a single shot. Don't get me wrong, her crew manned their stations to the best of their abilities and proved more than a threat to the planes that assailed her. But it would only ever be those planes. She would never get to support the men of the 3rd Marine Division as they stormed the beaches of Guam like her sister Pennsylvania would. She would never get to bombard Japanese positions on Iwo Jima with her own guns, as her older cousin Navarro would. Neither would she have the honor of hosting the surrender ceremony that would see Japan finally yield to the Allies, ending the Second World War, an honor which would fall to her younger, distant relative, USS Missouri. Many of Arizona's sister ships would go on to avenge her loss, but not Arizona herself. She would remain at the bottom of the channel, as they fought a war she was likewise meant to fight, and unlike other total losses such as Oklahoma and Utah, Arizona would remain below the waves, along with the majority of her crew, bones, clothes, belongings, and all. It seems many ships are remembered for the feats they achieved, but Arizona is remembered for being among those who never got to. When one looks up a video, movie, or book about World War II and America's involvement, they're almost invariably shown Pearl Harbor, which without fail gives them either a picture or a clip of Arizona's demise. And that's my point. She isn't remembered for her life. She's remembered for her death. She isn't remembered for the feats she performed. She is remembered for those she never got to. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all, that in the eyes of many, the most substantial thing she ever did was die. There is almost no mention of the life she lived, of the Battenberg Cups won by her rowboat crew, of the aid her sailors rendered to victims of war and disaster, of the many different corners of the world they got to visit. For so long, she's been reduced to a seconds-long clip that serves as the opener to an even greater story. But she has her own story, and with this series, I hope that we who have lived to see the victory she never did can come to better appreciate her legacy, both for those she took with her and for those she left behind.